All right. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for coming to our session today, Unpacking Symbols and Stories in Gilbert Stuart's Portrait of George Washington. My name is Philippa Rappaport. I'm the lead for education and engagement at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology. And I'm joined today by Briana Zavadil White, who is the head of education and public programs at the National Portrait Gallery. So some of you are already introducing yourselves in the chat. It's great to see you all here from all over, it looks like. Florida, Rhode Island, Colorado, Illinois, the Netherlands. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you need live captions, you can click on the Show Captions button in your menu. We'd love for this session to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free to share your comments and your thoughts in the chat. We'll also be covering questions. You can send them to Q&A if you like. I forgot to say we're also joined by Rhett Ransom, who's helping us behind the scenes. Okay, let's see. All right, so today's session is part of a larger series that we're inaugurating today. So during the school year 25-26, we'll have a 10-part series that is all about exploring teaching techniques, strategies, and resources to help tell the story of America's 250th and to support student learning at this milestone moment in American history. So the series will celebrate well-known people, events, and accomplishments of our nation, and also provide opportunities to discuss lesser-told histories that together form our national narrative. Our aim is to share with you a variety of techniques and ideas to help students think critically, recognize their own value, appreciate others' perspectives, and gain confidence to be engaged learners. So I'll share the link in the chat how you can register for these programs. Oops. But this is the lineup of what we'll have. They'll happen on the third Wednesday of every month. So in October, we'll be joined by an educator from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the program is Defining Freedom Amongst Ideas of Liberty. In November, we'll take a look at really investigating objects from inquiry to action with the National Museum of American History. And in December, we'll look at integrating local stories across subject areas with the Asian Pacific American Center. In January, we'll be joined by the American Art Museum to explore investigating civic ideals through art. In February, we'll look at STEAM challenges with the Air and Space Museum. And then as we get further into the spring, in March, we'll look at Native women leading the way. That's with the National Museum of the American Indian. The Postal Museum in April, building civic engagement through postal stamps. In May, promoting STEAM innovation and invention in the classroom. And then in June, fostering civic action in youth. And you can find all of these programs and registration information at learninglab.si.edu. And then you would click on our educator programs page and you'll find the whole lineup there. So a reminder that this session is being recorded. I should also say the page that you'll go to from that link, you'll also find the recorded archived sessions after they've happened, usually within about 72 hours. So we'd like to start out with a question, and I'll turn it over to Briana to field this. But our question is, what does it mean to read portraits?
Thanks, Philippa. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Briana White, and I'm at the National Portrait Gallery. As you are thinking about this idea of what it means to read portraits, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the Portrait Gallery and what we do to get us into this warm-up question. So as you're thinking about it and typing, I'm just going to talk just a little bit, but do type your response into the chat about what does it mean to read portraits. So the Portrait Gallery obviously is one of the museums of the Smithsonian. And the museum was created by an act of Congress in 1962, and we opened our doors in 1968. And we have a very clear mission, and that is to tell the story of this country through the people who have shaped our history, our culture, and even our contemporary moment that we're in. And the way that we look at portraits and engage our audiences with portraits is this idea of reading portraits. And so I see a couple of responses coming into the chat that reading portraits means pulling meaning from the images in order to understand the story of the individual. And then we have, let's see, we've got the sitter's personality. So unveiling the sitter's personality, their achievements through the iconography, exactly. And analyzing images to make meaning, as well as looking closely for clues and for insight. These are all fantastic answers. And then thinking about just as when we read a book or read an article or read anything, how we connect that visual, those observations to inferences. So how do we transition from the looking into the analysis? And then there are also thinking about the various visual elements that we see in a portrait that helps us tell the story. And Philippa, please feel free to chime in with any of the chats that I'm not getting to. And then another one is this idea of understanding the values and the perspectives of the people in the time that they're living, which I want everybody to hold on to because we're going to come back to that and then bring it to the contemporary moment as well. So I'm seeing more responses about observation and analysis based on what we see. So those are all fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that given your responses, we're going to have a really interactive session, and that is what I'm hoping for, and I know that that's what Philip is hoping for as well. So at the Portrait Gallery, we are a museum that explores portraiture through three lenses, through the visual arts lens, through the biography lens, and through the history lens. And so we're constantly bringing all these three lenses together to consider the story that the portrait is trying to tell. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that along the way. But the second piece that I want to introduce you to right off the bat is how we look. So Philippa, if you could bring us forward one. One of my most favorite looking strategies that I like to do with students, with teachers, and honestly with everybody is what we call a 30-second look. And it is exactly as it sounds. In just a moment, Philippa is going to bring up the portrait of George Washington onto the screen, not yet. And you all are going to have 30 seconds to take a look at it. And during that time, I want you to try and take in as many details as you can, all the things that you see, okay? And at the end of 30 seconds, we're gonna take the image off of the screen. And then we're gonna have a virtual conversation via our webinar chat about what you saw. And then we'll bring the image back and then we'll continue the conversation that way. So Philippa is gonna bring the image up on the screen. You're going to have 30 seconds of just quiet looking to take in as many details as you can. So I'll allow everyone just a few moments. All right, Philippa, if you could take us to our next slide. You all might have noticed that I was actually looking down at my watch because 30 seconds is real. When you say 30 seconds to a group of students, you want to give them the exact amount of time that you are saying. And so when you think about the 30 seconds that you just had to look at this piece, do you think that it was enough time or not enough time? You can go ahead and just say yes or no in the chat. Yes for enough time, no for not enough time. This is what I like to see. So many of you are saying, yes, absolutely enough time to take a look at this portrait. And just as many of you are saying, no, that it wasn't enough time to take a look at this portrait. So my next line of questioning, I think will be the answer to this question. So I want you to just envision yourselves in the gallery for a moment, because when we do this in the museum, we're looking at the portrait. And at the end of 30 seconds, the students, the educators, they all turn away from the portrait. Okay, so that is where we are right now. You're turned away from the portrait. And now I'm going to ask you a series of questions. And so every time I ask you a question, I want you to respond in the chat. So was Washington seated or was he standing? Okay, pretty unanimous, right? He was standing. Excellent. Um, in this portrait, there were two pieces of furniture. What are they? Okay, a table and a chair, or a table or a desk and a chair. Excellent, thank you. Um, what is underneath of the table or the desk? What'd you see underneath of it? Okay, books. Excellent. A rug. Wonderful. A carpet. Okay. What was on the table? Okay, we have a quill pen. We have an inkwell. Okay, I see a scroll, a feather. Okay, there's cloth, an open book. Okay, a red tablecloth, a tablecloth. Okay, excellent. There's a couple of people that said they didn't know or they didn't see. Okay, so if you could, there is a tablecloth on the table. If you could touch it, just imagine that you could feel the texture of it. What's it going to feel like? Okay, velvety, red velvet. Okay, excellent. Heavy, it's a heavy fabric. I also see soft and wool. Okay, excellent. We mentioned before, somebody mentioned before in the chat that it was red. Is it what kind of red is it? Is it apple red? Is it a nice Merlot? Is it something different? Okay, I see blood red, like a Merlot, burgundy. Okay, so something that is that's something it's a little bit darker, right? More rich, a deep red. Okay, excellent. Um, Now let's move over to the chair. Again, a texture question. The back and the seat of the chair. What kind of fabric is it? And what color? Okay, again, people are saying that red velvet, gold embroidered fabric. Okay, I love the details that people are adding into this. Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. And then there was, I can't remember. Okay, and then I just saw somebody had mentioned a wooden frame and a shield. So that is my next question, which is at the top of the chair, there is an emblem, right? And so we have it in the chat that it's a shield, and that there's red, white, and blue. Are there any other details in that emblem that we can say for sure based on what we saw? Perhaps American flag, there are stripes. Okay, excellent. There are stars. Okay, somebody needs to see the image again. And then it almost looks crest-like. Okay, excellent. Um, think about think about Washington standing in the image. Um, what is he wearing? I want you to think about his top, down to his shoes. So a long dark coat. We've got some lace, we've got breeches, okay. We've got black leggings. There are white cuffs that are on his wrists as well as around his neck. Okay. And then fancy loafers, which I love. Thank you. Uh, okay. In addition, because you can tell already that I love my texture questions, if you could touch his coat, what's it going to feel like? Okay. So we're getting the velvet, but then we're also getting wool. Um, and somebody responded with money. So we've got and this idea of a heavy material, right? And so maybe we're not quite sure what it is, but we're thinking heavy, we're thinking wool. Maybe it's like that really sort of rich velvet. Okay, and then I'm seeing that the coat looks more plain, like a plain material than some of the upholstery that we're seeing. Okay, exactly, exactly. What can we say about Washington's hairstyle? What did you notice? Okay, I'm seeing a wig. I'm seeing no wig. I'm seeing a white wig and a full white wig. Okay, carefully styled. Excellent. In this portrait, there were columns. How many were there? Okay, two, one. Excellent. Tell me about the sky behind Washington. Okay, there's a rainbow, and it's also cloudy. It looked like maybe there were mountains. Okay. And then somebody was waiting for me to ask about that. Okay. Is Washington inside or is he outside? Okay. Mostly everybody is saying that he is inside. Okay, excellent. And then my final question is in this portrait, there are two different animals. There are two different animals. What are they and where are they? I have a question mark. We missed this. No, we didn't see any animals. There's a lot of, I'm not sure. Somebody's saying a cat under the table, and a creature above the right hand, maybe some kind of bird. Okay. There's a reference to a dog on the table, as well as eagles on the table leg, and then a dog under the ark. Okay. We'll get to the ark idea in just a second. Okay. Okay, and maybe on the handle of the sword. Excellent. You all did an amazing, fantastic job your first time through of a 30-second look. So thank you very much. Philippa, if you could bring us to the next slide. It's only fair that we bring the portrait back for you to just take a moment and think about the kinds of questions that I was asking when you were turned away from the portrait, and for you to consider what you saw in my questions, what you didn't see when you were looking, and also how you might have remembered things differently. Okay. And that's just for you to consider. What I want to run through really quickly is what we call the elements of portrayal at the Portrait Gallery. And these are the visual clues that are found in portraits that help us tell the story of the image. So we kicked off this session talking about this idea of reading portraits. It is these elements that help you tease out the story. We have to start with our visual observations before we can start to move into analysis. Okay. So we start with the pose of our subject, right? In this case, we see George Washington in this oratorical pose. Um, somebody somebody in a portrait always has some sort of expression. It's always going to be something. Sometimes it's going to be really easy to tease out what it is, and sometimes it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Hairstyle. Hairstyle tells us so much when we think about likenesses of individuals. In a piece like this, it can help us determine era in which the portrait was created. So it helps us think about the time period in which the person lived. Clothing can tell us a lot, right? We talk about the idea of clothing being a symbol to somebody's perhaps economical status or social status. It might also tell you about their job function or career. It could tell you about their culture. The setting is key. Are they inside? Are they outside? Um, are they, you know, in the Oval Office? Are they in a laboratory? The setting helps us tell the story, um, as do objects, because objects become symbols. They are there to tell us very specific things about the individuals that are represented in the portrait. And we'll get to a lot of those objects in just a few moments. But I do want to point out that sometimes objects are very specific to an individual. So, for instance, and this portrait is a perfect case in point. There are books in this portrait. So, by having books in the portrait, we can say that this subject is educated, perhaps they're well traveled, etc. But if the titles are specific on these books, they are going to reference the subject specifically, right? It'll give you a little more of a hint, a little more of a biography of our subject, of our sitter of the portrait. Color sets tone, it sets mood. Um, a question that sometimes we'll ask of students is, you might see, a lot of one color in a piece. What happens if we change that color? There's a lot of red in this portrait. What would happen if that red drapery was royal blue? It would have a completely different feel as we look at it. Scale is two elements. It is how much space the individual within the portrait, how much they take up, but it's also the size of the portrait as a whole. We're looking at this virtually. And so, unless you've seen this portrait in person, you don't necessarily have a clear idea that this is a very large scale portrait. It is 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide. It is very big. And also, Washington takes up so much of the portrait. He is the focal point, that where we start, and then our eyes wander around all of the other elements. Medium is the materials that are used to create the piece. So this is an oil on canvas. But at the Portrait Gallery, we collect portraits that are photographs, prints, drawings, time-based media art. That is really anything that requires a plug, an electrical outlet, prints, drawings, mixed media. So the materials that are used to create portraits, there's so many different types, and the Portrait Gallery collects all of them. And then the last thing is artistic style. And so this is where we get into the style of the artist and the kinds of work that that artist created. And it's also the place where we can start talking about light and shadow. And you'll see later on in our session that we will talk more about this very specific style of this portrait, and how it came to be, as well as other portraits that might have inspired the look that we see here. Okay. Okay, so that is the elements of portrayal. Think of it as your toolkit for how we look. All right. Um, and just as a reminder, first we observe, and then we move into analysis. So you've heard me talk about all of these elements of portrayal. I wonder now what you all are wondering about what's in this piece, what it might mean, why it might be there. So I would encourage you to put your wonderings into the chat as we start to go through and break down the very specific elements of this portrait. Then we can see if we answered all of the questions or if there are more that are still missing. Okay, Philippa, next slide. Okay, so here we go. This portrait of George Washington was created by Gilbert Stuart in 1796. Um, we will um, we will get to the provenance and how it came to be in just a few moments. But I bring that up because of the very specific visual elements that are in this piece. So it's important to know who painted it. It's important to know when it was created. So 1796, we know that Washington is getting ready to leave office. So he is wearing a black velvet suit. He has white powdered hair along with a bow that's tied in the back. So Washington used the pomade and the white powder in this portrait. He was not wearing a wig. We know that the artist Gilbert Stuart was inspired by the theory of physiognomy, which is that your appearance reflects your character or your temperament. So when Stuart painted the portrait of Washington, it was really important that the time that the two of them spent together, that Stuart was painting the face from life. Um, on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that that Washington is holding a sword, and I didn't ask that question when we were talking about what you saw, but this sword is ceremonial in nature. It is not something that Washington would have taken into battle, but is more meant to be a representation, right, of his previous military experience. And then on the bottom left, we have the um, the black shoes with the silver buckles, and very specifically a Turkish rug. There is a story of Gilbert Stuart walking through Philadelphia with this actual rug slung over his shoulder. And a friend asking him why he was carrying this rug around town. And he said, just wait and see, and you'll see if I've done right by it. So we do know that the rug did, in fact, exist. Philippa, next slide. And Philippa, if I'm missing things in the chat, please feel free to interrupt me as well.
Okay, just quickly, do you want to hear some of the wonderings?
Oh, yes, please.
So here's one from Janet. For setting, why include a rare event like a rainbow? Rainbows signal optimism, but people know they're here one minute, gone the next, not every day.
Okay, excellent. We're going to get to the rainbow, so hold on to that. Thank you.
Okay, and then well, there were more about people, thinking strong leadership ability, willingness to protect the nation. I think those behind blog says, I think those may be acanthus leaves carved on the table leg, which I believe are also portrayed in the Capitol and have some significance. Symbols of freedom, I don't remember, but I think they're significant.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay, let me move on to the next slide.
Okay. Thank you, Philippa. Okay, so here we've got a lot of symbols in very small pockets of the portrait. So, as you all referenced when we were discussing what you saw, we have the representation of the American flag, 13 stars, 13 stripes. We have laurel that surrounds that emblem. And laurel, of course, is a symbol of victory. If you look at the top of the table, there was a lot happening in there. Um, there is, in fact, a dog. Not only that, there are two. So the inkwell, two dogs sit at the base of the inkwell, or Noah's Ark, as some of you referenced it being. On the inkwell is Washington's coat of arms. It is it's very lightly seen on the inkwell, but I'll show you the coat of arms in just a moment. There are two books that are on the table. There is Washington's hat. We see it. It's black, and there's a feather that's coming up from it. We've got the quill that's sticking out of the inkwell. And then we have this scroll, this piece of paper that is rolled up on the table. And so one of my wonderings always when I first started using this portrait and looking at this portrait was, what does the paper come to represent? Um, and I see the question about whether or not Washington got to pick out all of this stuff. Hold on to that question. I think the simple answer is yes and no, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So let's go through the backstory of the portrait a little bit more, and then we'll come back to that. And then on the right-hand side, at the top of this slide, you see the rainbow, which is, people have often said it looks sort of out of place in this portrait. And my response is always that I think that it looks like that because the artist was making sure that we know that it's in there, that we are very clearly meant to see it. And then also, there are storm clouds. We've got rays of light, and we've got sort of the gray storm clouds on the other really side of the window. So we have the rainbow and the storm clouds. One of the questions that I always ask students is, when do we see rainbows? And so we see them right after a storm. And if we think about when this portrait was created in 1796, what storm has our country just gone through? And that question, honestly, it is the perfect way to bring together what we see and how we can make meaning out of it. Because chances are students are going to be able to make that connection between a rainbow and a storm. And then if you're studying US history, they can make that connection between the storm and the American Revolution. And so now what we've done is we've created this place where students can think about this image and they can say, oh my gosh, okay, well, I can think about this image if I'm starting to think about Washington's role in the revolution, or I'm thinking about Washington as president. So the idea is that the symbols become ways that we can tease out that history and biography. Okay. Okay, Philippa, next slide, please. Okay. I wanted to put these two pieces up because they show us the Washington Family Coat of Arms, which is on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side is a book plate that Washington had created, where we know that he incorporated elements from the coat of arms. So, for instance, I know that when the coat of arms was originally created, the figure, the animal at the top was a raven and then was changed into a griffin. Um, and I just thought that it's one of those situations where we don't get to see the detail in the image. And so it is a perfect place to bring in another primary source document with your students to be able to show them that detail that we can't see so clearly. I don't we're getting a question in the chat about why Washington's name was misspelled on the right. I don't know the answer to that question. There is also the possibility that perhaps at that moment in history, that was how his name was spelled. I'm honestly not sure. Okay, Philippa, next slide. So here, the other animal that we see is the national bird, the bald eagle. And in fact, we see two of them. And they are both holding arrows. And they're at the top of the table leg. And the table leg is neoclassical in style, but it is also, it looks like the Roman fasciae, the symbol of the ancient Roman symbol of power and authority. And so we see that in both of these in both of these images. And if you go to the next slide, Philippa, I want to point this out because we know that Gilbert Stuart was inspired by the Great Seal of the United States, which was created in 1782. And so we see these references, right? We have the bald eagle. We see the eagle in the Great Seal holding arrows and olive branches. But again, in the portrait, they're only holding arrows. We have the emblem. So we've got the stars and stripes in the portrait, but in the seal we've got the blue and the red and the stripes. Okay, and then you see at the very top you see some stars. And then in addition to that, and it's a little bit hard to make out, but at the really at the eagle's head and sort of around the head, you've got these gathering clouds. And then below it, there are lines that are coming down, and those are more like rays of light. And so again, that it's related to the storm clouds and the light that we see in the portrait of Washington. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think this is last but not least. And this is actually one of my most favorite parts of the portrait. So the books have titles. They have real honest to goodness titles on them. On the table, there are books that are titled Federalist and Journal of Congress. Under the table, while there are 5 books, there are 3 that we see titles, and they are General Orders, American Revolution, and Constitution and Laws of the United States. So another story that I've seen when researching more about this portrait is that there was a conversation between Stuart and Washington about the books in the portrait and whether or not they should be sort of on a bookcase, sitting upright, and Washington saying, no, I want these books to look as if, they're something that I'm going to pull out and use, because they did, because they're meant for us to see him as a man of ideas, right? As a leader, as things that he would reference on a daily basis. Okay, that was a lot. It's a lot of symbolism in this portrait. Philippa, if you could move us to this next slide. Now that we're back here at the full portrait, and we've gone through the analysis of various aspects of the portrait, how can we begin to think about, or how do we think about portraits as windows to the past? So I'd like you to go ahead and put your response to that question in the chat. And what I'd like to do is to move on to our next slide and talk a little bit more about how the portrait came to be, and a little bit more about what we know about its provenance. So, we know that Gilbert Stuart, who was really a preeminent American portraitist, he went to Europe and he studied the style of state portraiture, the style of grand manner portraiture in Europe. And we know that he was inspired by portraits that came before. And so you can see on this slide, there is a portrait of Louis XIV that was done in 1701. I'd like to call attention to the red drapery, the positionality of his pose, and just sort of the overall uh, composition of the piece. And then on the left-hand side, we see the Conde de Aranda, which that portrait dates from 1769. And the Conde de Aranda was the Spanish ambassador to the United States. And here again, we see the table leg, we see the tablecloth that has been pulled up. There are papers that are strewn about. There is greenery and blue sky in the background. So we know for sure that Stuart was inspired by this style, this very specific style of portraiture. But the other thing that we know for sure is that he infused his portrait, that which we call the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, with all of these symbols of America, this country, of Washington's biography, and with all of the things that were happening in that specific moment in history. Okay, so I want to come back to the question that I posed about portraits being windows to the past. And Philippa, I'm definitely going to ask you to help me call out some of the responses here. So we've got decoding the symbols and contextualizing them. Excellent. Okay, that portraits can be windows to style, to culture, to design, to fashion, um, and thinking about how we and to be cautious about how we use them to understand the reality or the realistic portrayal of things. And I think that that's important because we do have to remember that we're looking at these portraits through the lens of a 21st century individual, and we're looking at a portrait from 1796. So we do absolutely have to think about it in that way. What else am I missing, Philippa?
They allow students to see the environment, dress, and everyday lives of the time. They
Okay.
allow artists to send messages along with the person who's being painted to those who view the paintings.
Yeah.
It's sort of,
Okay.
one person says it's like a conversation between those living then and those living today.
Yeah. And I think that that's an excellent point because we do need to think about we view it in one way, and I think that if we think about it in terms of you know what would it be like to step into that moment and consider the why of the portrait, and for instance we know that Stuart was very interested in having this portrayal of George Washington be the one that was for the ages, right? So we see other likenesses of Washington as a military general. We see various representations of him. But this is and winds up being that quintessential portrait of Washington as first president, um, and as leader of this as the first leader of this country. Excellent. Philippa, move on to the next slide, please. And this is where I want to talk just a little bit about how the portrait came to be. Um, what you see here are three replicas. So in 1796, um, Senator and Mrs. Bingham of Pennsylvania, they commissioned Gilbert Stuart to paint a full-length portrait of George Washington, with the idea that the portrait would then be sent to England for William Petty, who is the Marquess of Lansdowne or Lord Lansdowne, hence why the Portrait Gallery's portrait is the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. The portrait, it it went to England, and it stayed in William Petty's hands. It had various owners, but always stayed in England. And in 1968, came to the Portrait Gallery on long-term loan. And then in 2001, when the owners of the portrait decided to sell it, the Reynolds Foundation stepped in on the Portrait Gallery's behalf and purchased it, so it would be in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. But Stuart knew that he had such a great likeness of Washington when he created this portrait that he was then commissioned to create three more. And so there are replicas of the Lansdowne portrait. One of them is at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. One is at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And then the third is in the White House. So the White House portrait is a replica. So when we talk about the portrait that was saved during the War of 1812 in the White House, it was not our Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. It was the replica that you see on the screen that was actually in the White House at the time. And it's important to talk about the difference between replica and copy. So a replica is a portrait that is created by the individual who created the original, whereas a copy is going to be created by a different artist altogether. And if you move us on to the next slide, I said before that Stuart had gone abroad to Europe to study state portraiture. And he came back to this country with the specific purpose of painting portraits of Washington. He knew that if he could get sittings with Washington, that he could make a lot of money doing it. And he did. So Washington sat for Gilbert Stuart three times. The first is with this portrait that you see on the screen, which is the Vaughan portrait. This portrait is in the National Gallery of Art and is a replica. The original of the Vaughan portrait does not exist anymore. And I believe that there are maybe just a dozen, maybe less replicas of the Vaughan portrait. And if you go to the next slide, Philippa. The next portrait that Washington created was the Athenaeum portrait. And these portraits were actually, both of these portraits of Martha and George Washington were created at the request of Martha Washington, with the idea that they would be installed in Mount Vernon. You'll notice that they are looking at each other when displayed this way, and that was going to be the idea. But Stuart created the portraits and then never gave them to the Washingtons. Instead, what he did was he used the portrait on the right, the Athenaeum portrait, to create many replicas. It is unclear how many actually exist, but there could be around 100 of them. And so every time Stuart's creating a replica, he's getting paid for it, right? He's being commissioned to create them. These two portraits are in the Portrait Gallery's collection, and we own them jointly with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And the reason why they're called the Athenaeum portrait is because after Gilbert Stuart passed away, these two portraits went into the Boston Athenaeum's collection, and they were held there for about 150 years. Until the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Portrait Gallery jointly acquired the portraits. And so when you come to the Portrait Gallery, hopefully you're coming in the 3 years that they're on view here before they go up to Boston for 3 years, and then they come back down here for 3 years, and we swap back and forth. The other important thing to note about this portrait of Washington is that this is the portrait that you see on your $1 bill. And I always love telling people that that's the piece, and it is purposefully not finished because really Stewart was using it sort of as a sketch, right? He had a good likeness of Washington that he would use over and over and over again, and he'd use this as the basis for it. Okay, next and final. So here we are, right back where we began with the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. So I asked you previously, how are portraits windows to the past? And since this is the kickoff for Cultivating Learning's 250th series, and we're on the eve of the country's 250th anniversary, the question that I pose to all of you is really thinking about connecting past to present, which we touched on earlier. So, what's the importance of studying historical portraits in our present moment? Why would we spend the time to do that? Let's see. I like that some of these responses that I'm seeing are portraits humanize the past. Excellent. It's a clear link to our past. Storytelling is important now and in the past. This image can be used as a primary source, right? It's also a way to think about if Stewart's whole goal was to create a Washington for the ages, right? There is a certain level of mythology and national lore when we look at this portrait. And so again, this idea of looking at it through our contemporary lens backwards, I think is important. Um, and thinking about how similar we are 250 years later, and how also there are symbols now that are just as relevant as they were so many years ago, right? And I noticed the comment in the chat about how this portrait can be both considered a primary and a secondary source. I 100% agree with you because there's always artist interpretation, right? This is a whole other session too. A session on portraits as primary versus secondary sources is a whole other session. What else am I missing, Philippa?
Um, some more on portraits give us clues about how people saw themselves and how they wanted others to see them. They help us understand and maybe better frame how we see ourselves. And then some people are making connections then to how students are using social media, and that's another way of trying to portray information.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, Thank you, everyone. It's been a really fantastic conversation. It's been a while since I've had a really great virtual conversation about this piece. So Thank you. I know Philippa's taking us to another slide, which I'm going to turn it back over to her.
Okay. Um, Here, let me just go to the next. What is? Oh, so this is for later, but before I close the slides, I just wanted to put up, if you would be willing to provide feedback for today's session. This is the QR code, but I'll also just put the link in the chat. So in a way, I'd rather just move on, even though you might not have time to get your phone out, but I will put the link in the chat. So a couple of things. I wanted just to ask Briana to walk us through the Learning Lab collection. So we have a collection here that we put together to accompany today's session. And I'll put that link in the chat now, but if you could just walk us through, Briana, what everyone will find here.
Sure, sure. Of course. Okay, so you obviously probably can already tell that this is a portrait that we like to use in our programming. And so these first few oh my gosh, I'm the what are they? They're called
The tiles, right?
thank you. These first few tiles are about the various ways that the Portrait Gallery is thinking about using the Lansdowne portrait with audiences. So we have a Google Arts and Culture story. We have another Learning Lab collection that's called Uncovering the Mystery of the Portrait. At the top of our session, I said that the Portrait Gallery really likes to use looking strategies, and I introduced you to the 30-second look. In this collection, there is a link to Project Zero's artful thinking routines. If you are not currently using them, I would highly recommend checking them out. There are things like see, think, wonder, claim, support, question, etc., that are really um, great ways to engage your students in conversations about works of art. And then as we move through the collection, there are additional resources about the conservation of the Lansdowne portrait just a few years ago, along with ways or ways in which we read portraits and ideas for reading portraits, and then why we read portraits. And then the link to a website on the Smithsonian page showing all the portraits of the presidents that we have in our America's Presidents exhibition. Our landing page, our profile page for Learning Lab, and importantly, our Learn page, which takes you to all the really wonderful things that the Education and Public Programs Department does at NPG. And then the final few links are taking you to some of those additional images that I showed you at the very end, the Vaughan portrait, the Athenaeum portrait of George Washington, and the portrait of Martha Washington. So I hope that you find it useful. Hopefully it'll be a great resource.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll stop sharing and we're open for any questions you might have, comments, thoughts. And I've meant to say this at the beginning and I missed it, so I'm going to say it now. Is just you can see why we wanted to open our 10-session series with Briana, because she's really an amazing educator and she really has so much talent in bringing portraits to life. So please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or your comments. Um, and we're open. I don't think we have any outstanding that I meant to bring up for you. And while we're waiting for those, oh, go ahead.
Oh, somebody had asked just now and before why the rainbow was inverted. It's a very good
Yes.
question. And a question that I do not have the answer to. I do think that Stuart wanted the rainbow to stand out. So that could potentially be a reason, but that's just conjecture on my part.
We have one from Janet. Did George Washington write anything about how he wished to be presented?
There are actually there there are letters back and forth between Washington and Gilbert Stuart. Um, so there is some back and forth between the two of them. Yes. But my response always is it is a negotiation between the artist and the subject, how the portrait comes to be.
I love that. Um, okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was such a pleasure to be back and start this new series with you all. And we hope to see you next month on the third Wednesday of the month. And have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much, Brianna, for starting us off.
Thanks for having me, Philippa. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.